Welcome to Dr. Gore's Bedtime Stories. Now, first of all, I'd like to complain that not a single one of you out there knew that my favorite color was red. What a bunch of fucking idiots. So nobody got to join me this week apart from this lovely lady here.
Woo!
So we shall continue with the final test. There's not enough meat to last out the winter, the necromancer told them, the storm clouds hovering above them like a displeased father over a noisy cradle that had suddenly gone quiet. The three apprentices stood in front of the door to the hut he blocked with his withered body, their meagre blankets bundled in their arms in anticipation of being allowed to set up before the hearth as they had the previous winter. The necromancer nodded at the bandit chief, who marched in front of the youths with three sword blades clutched in one bony hand. He planted the blades in a line where the hard packed earth met the stone shelf that comprised the floor of the shack. Out the way. Omrose, Auer, and Halim looked to the sword hilts, gently swaying at waist level like an iron harvest, the only crop this high barren field would bear. Then one of them moved the slightest bit, and it all happened very quickly. Omrose and Halim went forward, and Auer jumped back, and as a peal of thunder came forth from the south, they made their moves. She had to go back for her, Our thought as her tough bare feet slid down the side of the gully leading away from the hut. She had turned around. She had stopped running or Omrose would die. Her feet did not listen, and the twilight fell around her as her eyes filled. Our was afraid, so she was abandoning her friend, like a disloyal beast that only knew fear, that a pursuer came down the opposite side of the gully, but Auer was ready and ducked past him, snatching his femur to arrest her own dangerous momentum and sending the skeleton crashing into the ground where its left elbow blasted apart on a rock. She caught us. I know that's quite graphic. She caught herself from falling, and seeing that no others were yet upon her, she grabbed a large stone. The skeleton scrambled up just as the rock caved in its skull, and down it went. She blasted its knee off, and with the long bone of its femur in one hand and the rock in the other, she resumed her flight. Wow, this girl's got guts.
They're not for her friend.
Well, no. Omrose was scared. Our knew this, just as scared as Our was, and hurt inside, just as Our was. Our tried to stop herself from remembering her former mistress's smiles, her sad eyes, the nights when she went to her old slave and wrapped her arms and legs around her and sobbed quietly. Our not daring to move lest Omrose pulled away. She would come back. Our lied to herself and knew it. But she could not do otherwise for fear that she might slow for an instant and be caught by the new pair of skeletons that now chased her pell-mell down the steep crag. After she escaped, she would come back and rescue Omrose.
Sure, I believe you.
Yes, yes, absolutely. We're right behind you. 3 steps separated Hallam from the necromancer. And as the eunuch darted forward, and with the first step he drew a sword from the earth. The miserable old monster was quick, but none was quicker than Halim, who had so carefully hidden his true strength and speed. Seeing the necromancer gape as he took his second step, Halim grinned, for the bandit chief was only now moving forwards on his left, and none were quicker than Halim. As he brought the sword upper hand, its point level with the necromancer's stomach. The old man was not moving so fast now, his hands coming up far too slow to intercept the sword. The first syllable of some incantation only now forming on his surprised mouth, and none were quicker than Halim. Save Omrose. The sword she had drawn came around to the right of Halem, the rusty point nicking the necromancer's shoulder as it passed him and found its target. The eunuch's knees buckled and his arm jerked. His sword twisted in his suddenly clumsy fingers, and he smacked the necromancer's chest with the flat of the blade instead of running him through. The force of Omrose's blow flipped Halem backwards. The cold sky above, and then the upside down image of the bandit chief running towards him, and the earth he was crashing down onto. Fat red raindrops spattering the dust and snow, and then he landed, having come fully around to see one of the necromancer's corpses swaying in front of the laughing old man, a small headless thing with more meat on it than most of the undead. Oh, Halim's lips made the shape as he realized she had decapitated him.
Oh
And
shit.
then the world grew dimmer and dimmer. As he saw Omrose approach him, the last thing he felt, her fingers hoisting him up by the.
Oh, Beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
Beautiful.
Very nice. Very, the necromancer managed. And Omrose suddenly felt dreadfully weak and began to cry, her dripping tears washing some of the grime from Halim's severed head as she carried it to her master. He had never before praised her so openly, and if she were purring inside instead of sobbing, he stroked her again with his words. Excellent work, truly. You're as unpredictable as the weather. Snow began drifting down, and more thunder came from beneath them, where the true storm lurked over the lower peaks. The necromancer dusted himself off and looked from Omrose to the skeletal bandit chief. With a sigh, he patted Omrose's shoulder and said, cut Halim's tongue out and give it to yon sword master. He'll catch her for us, but perhaps words will work better than other weapons on Little Hour. Bring her to us, bandit. Omrose's wild, dangerous smile found its twin on the necromancer's face as she clumsily used the sword to free Halim's tongue. Tossing it to the bandit, she saw it fly between his jaws and then vanish as if Halim as his tongue had never existed, and she were simply a young woman having a most peculiar nightmare in her harem. Then she saw the tongue had somehow adhered itself to the interior of the skull's hollow mouth, and now licked the horror's teeth, and Omrose knew she would never wake up. Hmm. Hour came to the end of the unbroken promisance and looked across the wide chasm. She had spent countless hours jumping around the mountain top in preparation, but standing on the edge, she realized, as she'd always did when she surveyed even the narrowest part of the crevice, just how impossible a leap it would be to the far side. If she did make it, though she could run all the way down the steep mountainside instead of trying to descend the cliffs, or so she hoped. Then Aua turned away from her treacherous escape route to face her pursuers, a stone in one hand and a saber in the other. There were still only two, and she hurled the fist-sized rock with a skill she had steadily honed over the previous year. She turned to meet the charge of the second skeleton. Without looking to see if her missile connected with the first, it did. The spirit in the stone honoring the deal it had silently brokered with Hour and flying true. The targeted skeleton's skulls exploded and its body tumbled in a heap at her feet. But its fellow launched itself off a boulder with its sword coming down to split Auer's shoulder. Auer had watched them meticulously, and occasionally the necromancer even allowed her to inspect an unanimated example so that she might learn how each piece fit together and worked in harmony. And so she knew exactly how the bones could and could not move. And she sidestepped to the leaping skeleton at the last moment. Its twisting shoulder blade cut her underarm as she brought the loose bone in her right hand down into the gape where it extended sword arm met its body.
Ooh.
There was, there was a grating sound as it landed and tried to raise its weapon, and she pulled down on her bone like a lever. Its arm popped neatly off as she planted her foot on its spine and shoved it off the cliff. Its other hand swung around to grab her face, but she kept her hair shorn close to the scalp and it found no purchase as it tumbled away over the precipice. Before it even broke apart on the rocks below, she tucked its sword into the warm belt that her leggings fastened to and began trotting along the edge of the chasm. There's nowhere to run, she heard Hallam say, and her left foot twisted underneath her as a loose piece of stone slid out from under it and clattered down the side of the crevice. A year before, the skeleton who had appeared beside her would have been indistinguishable from its fellows, but Auer had taught herself to look closely at the bones and the faint fissures where his broken arms and legs had been fused back together, identified him at once. The bandit chief held a sword loosely in his arm, and behind him she saw a pack of skeletons fast approaching. Auer, the bandit chief said, listen to me. Auer did not. Limping towards the prominence she had long before chosen as her leaping off point, resolutely refusing to consider how a sprained ankle might impact her jump. Her, he quickly circled in front of her, his sword raised, her hand tightened on the hilt of her own weapon, and she grimaced to put weight on her left leg. Don't, the bandit said. I have every advantage, and instead of her usual cautiousness, Auer came at him hard as Hallam would, and he fell back as the swords met, and she tried to drive him over the edge. He spun around her on the plateau side, backs bumping, and she lost her balance. His hand snatched her tunic and pulled her back from the precipice, and then their swords connected again as she used the momentum he again granted her to attack. Without being able to speak, he had lacked the ability to instruct the children as well as he might have, and his bones had tallied many more years than she of swinging iron and steel. But still she drove him back, her teeth gritted, her sword a russet blur. He tried talking to her, but the ringing of steel, metal on metal, sang louder than he could speak. At last she overextended a jab, and he kicked her in the stomach, bringing her to her knees as she gagged on the pain in her gut. Instead of running her through or pinning her down, he dropped to a squat and hissed at her. Auer, listen to me. He glanced over his shoulder. You can't get away. Not now. I've tried finding ways to help, but there are still too many of the mindless ones under his sway. The dead travel fast, girl. Now quickly, before she comes. Ombros means to kill you. She killed Hallam and you killed Hallam, Auer said, still on her knees with her head bowed, but slowly curling her toes under her feet to spring up. You brought us here, didn't you? And if Ombros is confused, who can blame her? Who can blame any of us? I, the skeleton turned its skull away from her. I didn't. Our sword blasted his wrist into powder that joined the snow now falling around them, and as both his sword and the hand that gripped it fell, she pivoted on her good ankle and hobbled along the chasm. The other skeletons had reached them now and came pouring down the mountainside towards her, a flash flood of clattering bones. She was panting, and her left leg stabbed her from toe to groin with every footfall. But she pushed herself faster, shards of muddy ice coming loose from the precipice beside her. The three skeletons dropped down in front of her, and she limped even faster towards them, her eyes focused on the spit of rock jutting out between her and the skeletons. A small tree grew from a crack near the top of the cliff on the opposite side of the chasm. Death won't save you from him, the bandit chief cried from just behind her. But then she turned, the toes of her good foot pressing down on the edge of the rock. Our leapt off over the gulf, the far side rearing up through the thickening snow, and she hit the trunk of the tree chest first. The cracking of her ribs was louder than the cracking of the wood under her impact.
Oh.
Her legs slammed into the sharp stone of the cliff. Her arms flopped around the base of the tree from the collision, but her strength had been driven out along with her breath, and after a single triumphant instant, she limply fell away from the tree and the cliffside into the
Oh.
abyss. Her last thought of Omro's crooked smile. I was hoping it would be you, the necromancer told his apprentice as they stood waiting before his hut in the snow, and Omrose returned his grin. Wow, what do you think so far?
Oh, amazing. I love it so much.
That is one twisted necromancer.
Yeah. I wonder if he's going to bring them back.
And if he does, as what?
Yeah.
Do you want to carry on for a bit?
Yeah.
Okay. Chapter 6, The Soldier and Death. The mercenaries were 3 days out from the camp when the men did what Manuel knew they would, which was a day more than he had expected. The first night was free, what with Werner and the rest elated at the promise of wages away from the front line and the fat stack of rations given to each of them. Manuel had actually gotten an honest night's sleep once they had stopped a few leagues off, with the witch tether wrapped around his wrist, and the hope she would scream if she was disturbed in the night.
Um,
The front of the witch's hood had a tightly laced slit, which Manuel opened to give her food and drink. The glimpses he caught of her features when he did were vague, especially with the blindfold she wore under the sack. But von Stein's parting words ensured that to Manuel's grey eyes she bore more than a passing resemblance to both his wife and his niece. Her arms were pinned down by the second chain, and so he had to hold the water skin and hard loams to her dark lips after removing her gag. But she made it easy for him by being neither resistant nor overtly eager to be fed and watered. He did not replace the gag after pulling it down around her neck the first night. The first day proper, it rained from dawn to dusk, and Manuel let them keep the road, with the men taking shift to scout ahead, lest they encounter a contingent of any variety. The roads were only safe so long as one had the strength of numbers. The day after that, one of the men had probably noticed something, perhaps when he was hoisting the bottom of his heavy, musty sackcloth to help her relieve herself. They had enjoyed quite the laugh when Manuel had noticed her trying to squat and gone to assist, and they must have noticed how small her feet were or something. And then his already dubious claim of political hostage turned into whatever spattered his boots. After that, they spoke more to themselves, eyeing the bundled prisoner with a renewed curiosity. Emmanuel did not sleep that night. Obviously, he could not stay awake the entire trip west, and so some part of him was relieved when they made their move in the morning. Get it out the way now and quickly. The Christabel cousins were key, and if he could break them, the odds were back on his side. Manuel, Werner greeted him, and from the man's honest grin, Manuel knew what he was about. Think I'll help her with the business of this morning. Don't mess in your boots again, sir. You can't have her, Manuel addressed the bundled up trio of Christabel, Kolhoffen, Christabel, and Bernardo.
God.
Yeah, Christoph, Christabel, Kolhoffen, Christabel, and Bernardo, as much as Werner. Von Swine kept the pay until we get back with a letter which we won't get if anything's done to her, right? So a fat purse later, or a poke with a witch now, and maybe a hanged neck for the trouble, which is no choice by my mind. Put yours from it. Which, said Werner, and Manuel hoped he had not erred in disclosing this. He had. Well then, I figure it ain't my fault what I'm about, is it? She's done bewitched me. She bewitched you lot. I ain't fucking no witch, said Christoph, crossing his arms. That settled it for Manuel. If you took out Werner quickly, that would leave Bernardo, and with the Christabels, I will, said Kolkov. Why not? See if she's cold inside like they say, eh? This left Manuel with a serious problem. One Christabel simply was not enough, and he doubted. Settled then, Werner said, and Manuel noticed the dagger in the man's left hand. When had he drawn that? You say we could toss her for it, said Bernardo, pushing between the Christabels. Manuel let his eyes flit over their camp, but did not back down as the second man advanced up the small rise. Terrain was far from everything in a battle, but he had the high ground for a moment, the rest having set their fire lower on the side of the hill facing away from the road. But the lack of vegetation, save for hazel trees, would not help a uh, would not help her hide even if it were able to get away, and Werner were too close, far too close for that. Right, said Manuel, recognizing that they had him left him little choice if he wanted to safely return to his vulnerable family. Werner and the rest would take turns with the witch on the hillside, leaving the wet sackcloth and chains in place. Her, her silence of the march possibly broken by muffled screams. Manuel would want to go off a distance, maybe vomiting from the sight and sounds, but he must force himself to watch lest they get carried away. If she were to survive the rest of the trip to Spain, he would have to make sure none of them were too fierce, and that meant observing every time, especially with Werner. She was a witch, and so, of course, no question would be asked when she was delivered, and then back to von Stein and payment, and back to his family. Katharina. Bernardo hoisted the sack-covered woman to her feet. Werner still watching Manuel closely, and in that instant the artist resolved never to see his wife again. Better not to see Katerina at all than not be able to look her in the eye. Better to sleep forever than not be able to sleep well again. Fuck that and fuck them. Sacrifice, said Manuel. God is sacrifice. I hear that somewhere, but it stuck. The very idea that money earned through evil acts, that money could be more important to him than to the act in his image. To sacrifice oneself is preposterous, isn't it? Preposterous. What? Werner tightened his hold on his dagger. What in fuck are you on about? What in fuck? Manuel nodded sagely. Indeed, I'm talking about sacrificing the little lamb there. Oi, Bernardo, I get first go and then there'll be no fucking tosses for it
Oh,
other than
God.
who goes second.
Oh, God.
Bernardo looked at Werner, who squinted at Manuel. Behind them, the Christabels relaxed their shoulders, and Manuel wondered if they would have backed him after all. Too late now, and he winked at Werner as he pushed past him. Would the rapist plant the dagger in his back or in his neck? Manuel held his breath as their shoulders brushed, but then Werner clapped him on the back. You're right then, Manuel, Werner laughed. I like going last myself anyhow. Give Master Artiste first go, Bernie. You said, Bernardo began, but Manuel cut him off. I got some butter in my bag that's a little sour. Fetch it for me, and I'll give you next. Manuel's grimace must have looked enough like desire for Bernardo not to question him further, and he trotted to the artist's pack. Werner was saying something loud to the Christabels, and Manuel roughly grabbed the witch's shoulder, wondering if he addressed the front or the back of her head, as he chanced a whisper. When I said you are run, Manuel said in perfect, lousy Spanish. Not good English either. He almost gagged on his words. His voice sounded impossibly loud. Fuck, I hope you're comprehended. I understand it, Klaus Manuel Deutsch of Bern, the witch's voice ghosted through a hood in far smoother Spanish than his. Manuel froze. Her use of his name unsettled him greatly, and just for a moment he wondered if she really was a witch. Then he asked himself if it would change his actions if she were, and he had to admit it would not. She had not given any previous indications that she understood him at all, and certainly none that she could speak. Take the chains off, the witch whispered. But first the mask. I'll be blind until my eyes adjust. So stall them off. So stall them once it's off. Don't be rash. Did she fucking say something? Said Bernardo. She's begging me to not let you fuck her, Manuel replied, unlacing the slit in her hood and widening it enough to get her hand inside. He felt her hot cheek as he clumsily fumbled with the blindfold, the stink of neglect and the waste wafting out of the hole in her covering, making his own eyes water. He got the blindfold up, and as he removed his hand, he saw her brown eyes blink and began bubbling over, even in the shadowed interior of her hood. She was a Moor, he saw, and he laughed nervously at his folly. He had thought her face and bare feet were simply stained and dirty. What? Racist cunt.
Yeah. At least he's going to rescue her, hopefully.
Yes. I mean,
Hopefully.
he may be a racist, but he's still a gentleman.
Yeah.
Are you taking that offer? Werner asked, and Manuel heard his boots squeaking in the wet leaves as he approached. If I didn't care what my hole looked like, I'd have stuck a sack over one of you bastards soon as Paula and her stargazers jumped boat, said Manuel, spinning the moor around to get at the clasp of the chain at her back. She's a witch, said Christoph, panic in his voice. If you let her go, she'll do something. I, said Werner from behind Manuel, and it did not relax the artist to see the man had traded his dagger for a sword. She'll do something, all right. Four somethings. Five if you stop being a cunt, Christabel. Manuel removed the pin, locking the waist chain in place, and the heavy iron fell on his boots, the edges of the sack bulging and popping as she flexed her arms. Werner gave Manuel a smile, the sort of smile fishermen exchange when one of them has landed something big. Bernardo beside him with the orange tinted butter pooling in his sweaty little hand. Manuel almost threw up, far more nervous than he'd ever felt before a battle. Werner's sword was right there. I hope you're a fighter, bitch, Werner barked beside Manuel's ear. Manuel's fingers were shaking as he slid out the pin from the neck chain. The iron had been tight as a dog collar against her throat, and as he tossed it aside, he heard her take a deep breath, but he could not warn her. He could not say anything. Werner was too close. I'll give you space to work, Manuel. Werner nodded, knowingly walking around the witch so that he stood above them on the hill. Bernardo was still holding the butter out to Manuel to his left, and the Christabel somewhere behind. Manuel held his breath and, bunching the sackcloth in his fist, pulled the heavy, damp bag up and over her head, finally releasing the woman. She was a girl, a naked girl, and there was nowhere for her to go.
Mm.
They were surrounded, and now she was standing nude, and she was shivering in the pale dawn of the hill. And Manuel realized what he had done. They would both die on the hill, and she would have been raped. And if he had not intervened, he could have kept her alive, but he could have kept her from seeing what they were doing to her. He could have one always has a choice. Manuel knew, and he had made his. Werner's sword was still out, but he had backed away enough that Manuel stood on an honest chance of drawing his own in time, assuming nobody stabbed him in the back. Well, aren't you gonna kiss her? Bernardo's fetid breath drifted over the artist's shaking shoulder. Manuel tried to pull himself together.
God.
You actually kissed them, you fucking ponce! That says it all, really. Manuel grinned at Bernardo and snatched the lump of melting rancid butter out the mercenary's extended palm.
Oh
He
no.
took it with his left hand off. Took it with his left hand offhand, his offhand, which Werner might have noticed if he was not laughing at Bernardo's expense. And Werner laughed harder as Manuel shoved the butter in Bernardo's mouth and shoved him backwards. Then Werner stopped laughing as he saw how hard Manuel had pushed Bernardo falling backwards with his arms flailing, and Manuel saw the Christabels were even closer than he had thought. And for some reason, the assholes had their weapons drawn as well. For fuck's sake. Werner was Werner was hoisting his sword back and bounding forward, even as Manuel's right hand closed on the hilt of his own weapon. And before Bernardo crashed onto the moist earth behind them, everything went to shit. Like it was all hunky dory beforehand.
Yeah.
Now it
Yeah,
goes to
no,
shit.
now it's bad.
I have noticed this book does spend a lot of time telling you how it's only going to get worse.
Yeah.
I have to say it's delivered. The witch ran it exactly the wrong way, bumping, bumping into Manuel as she spun away from Werner and went behind the artist, directly towards the
No.
Christabels and Bernardo. Manuel's sword was still only half drawn as Werner brought his weapon around. But the prospective rapist had swung it sidearmed, and so Manuel was able to intercept the blow with the non-sheathed half of the blade. His wrist twisting painfully, and his belt loops popping off as his scabbard was torn loose from the impact.
Mm.
Manuel's right fist was shaking and could not hold on to the heavy sword. His wrist sprained from the awkward parry. The sheath fell off the edge of Manuel's hand and a half as he clumsily traded the weapon into his butter-slick left hand.
Oh God.
And then Werner was bringing his sword down again. And Manuel hopped back out of the way, slipping down the hillside. But Werner did not hesitate, pressing the advantage. Manuel knew he had a moment or two before Bernardo was up and swinging behind him, to say nothing of the Christabels, and he had to put Werner down at once, or all was lost. More precisely, he thought, fuck, 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 fuck. But surely the veteran was aware of the rest. Both of their swords were long and heavy, and once committed to a maneuver difficult to alter in their deadly course. Manuel waited for Werner to swing again, and when the blow fell again, jumped out of range. Only this time he swung his own sword sideways as he dodged, his swing perfectly timed to cut into Werner's overextended sword arm. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, the rancid butter coating Manuel's palm collaborated with his momentum to send the sword leaping out his hand, flying past Werner and embedding in the dirt.
Uh,
Fuck! Manuel screamed as his botched attack sent him stumbling into Werner. But rather than trying to get his sword up in time, Werner threw his elbow into Manuel's ribs. Manuel fell past Werner, but one of his kicking feet caught the mercenary behind the knee, and Werner lurched forward down the hill. Manuel's sword was right there, and he planted one hand on the ground beside it and snatched the weapon with the other, propelling himself to his feet. That was the idea, at least. But his sprained wrist buckled as he tried to push himself up, and he fell back down, his buttery left hand slipping off the hilt of his weapon. He's having a good day. Werner was charging back up the hill towards him. And still on his knees, Manuel could get his feet on his sword, but not both.
mm,
He chose the sword, and as Werner's steely blade arced down at him, Manuel twisted around. Seeing the flashing metal above him, the artist pitched himself forward to avoid it, belly flopping onto the cold ground, only to feel something stop his sword. It was Werner, the tip of Manuel's sword flush with the man's spine. The hand and a half had bounced off the top of Werner's codpiece and passed through his linen and silk shirts and into his stomach. The momentum of Werner's own missing string carried him over to the side, skin and cloth tearing as he was disemboweled on Manuel's sword. Werner was still screaming as he fell, his uncoiling intestine tangling on Manuel's handguard and arresting the man's fall for a long and terrible pause until his gut tore and he hit the earth.
Oh, beautiful.
Werner screamed and screamed as Manuel rolled on his back, knowing Bernardo or one of the Christabels was right behind him. Knowing he was about to die, but laughing in spite of it because at this very goddamn least he had field dressed Werner like a deer.
Worth it.
Yep, there was no one there. Scrambling up and peeling Werner's innards off the guard of his sword, Manuel saw two bodies at the base of the hill. And then a scream came from deeper in the wood, just as Werner's finally trailed off him. Sorry, Werner's finally trailed off. Trotting cautiously down, he saw the Christabels laying side by side, their shirt fronts soaked with blood, as though they were conjoined brothers fallen victim to the unsuccessful separation. Clean swords still held in lily white hands. Hearing the high scream again, he set off after Bernardo and the witch, delaying further investigation of the corpses. Beyond the base of the hill was the undergrowth Manuel had longed for on the hillside, and when the scream did not come again, he slowed to a walk, every juniper patch and hornbeam thicket carefully examined. Then he found a blood splatter on the ground, and following the trail toward another hillock rearing up among the budding hazels, he heard a moan. Pushing through a clump of junipers, he found them at the mouth of a small cave in the side of the hill. The witch wore Bernardo's clothes, and the naked man lay at her feet, making small wet noises and holding both hands to his bloody mouth. As if she had been waiting for his audience, the witch nodded at Manuel and squatted over Bernardo, slitting his throat with a dagger. With
Yeah.
his dagger, Manuel realized, and even though he could see the weapon, his hand went to the empty sheath at his waist. She must have taken it when she bumped into him on the hill, and she must have used it on the Christabels, and now obviously on Bernardo.
Fuck yeah.
In the better light, she looked older than he had originally thought, but not by much. She was short, but surprisingly well built. Her close cropped hair, the dull greyish brown of the bistre Manuel used for his ink, her skin darker than dead leaves at her feet. And in the time it had taken him to kill one man on equal footing, she had killed three, and all with his dagger. You're a witch, said Manuel, a bitter metallic taste in his mouth. He realized he had bitten his tongue when he'd fallen during the fight, and he spit red. Is that it? Yes, the witch said in almanac German to match his, and he saw her mouth was smeared with blood. And you used your witchcraft on them. Manuel smiled to hear such words leave his mouth. No, I used your knife on them, said the witch. I saw that. Manuel nodded, pushing the rest of the way through the prickly bars of the juniper and looking down at the witch and Bernardo's leaking body. That's your witchcraft, isn't it? Being so good with the blade? The way so called learned men attribute. Then Manuel stopped. Bernardo was getting up, planting his bloody hands in the thick crimson pool his neck had created. and he jerked up to his feet, the flow at his neck quickening from the exertion. He stood swaying beside the witch, who smiled faintly at Manuel. The artist was also a soldier, and he knew a dead man when he saw one, and Bernardo was most assuredly dead. The wound in his neck as wide as Manuel's thumb, and deep enough that the risen corpse turning its head, Manuel saw the hint of bone that must be his spine.
Oh.
Manuel was going to be sick. He was. Manuel started awake in the shadowy cave long after the rain started, thunder murmuring its displeasure to be left outside. His wrist hurt, and he had no idea where he was. Confusion and pain adding a sinister edge to the gloom. Between the artist and the mouth of the cave was a small campfire. Emmanuel lay very still, trying to straighten out what had actually happened from what his exhausted mind had made him dream before collapsing. Yet the whole morning seemed implausible, and he was cold and damp and sore, and he could smell the char of the cooking pork. So he got up and went to the fire where the witch sat in front of a joint of roasting meat and a simmering stew pot. I
Poor
wonder at you, Niklaus
Munich.
Manuel Deutsch of Bern, said the witch. When she did not offer him her water skin, he rooted through the piled bags at her feet until he found one. He dug deeper until he found another skin full of wine and an apple. Then he sat down. Do you? He sounded scared to himself and realized that he was. He didn't know where his sword was, nor his dagger. Fuck. I do wonder. If those men hadn't meant to rape me, if you would have set me free. I wonder. When you found me, when your master was ordering you to deliver me, you said the Spanish men would burn me, yes? At best. Manuel took a slug of wine. So that is all right. You were not happy about it, but you would have done it. But when they decided to rape me, you told me to be ready to run. That was foolish. We both would have been caught, and I would still have been raped, and you probably would have been killed. Are you foolish enough to think that you could have fought them all when one of them almost finished you? No, I didn't. Manuel took another pull. I didn't think they would be so close. I thought you might be able to get away, or that the Christabels would come around if I put Werner down quick. Still, foolish as you say. If they hadn't tried what they did, would you have tried to let me go, or would you have given me to this Inquisition? The witch was watching him closely, and something he could not place nagged at him. I don't know, Manuel said, reserving his lies for those who paid him. I thought about it, of course, thought of little else. I'd like to think so, but we'll never know now, will we? No. The witch sighed, and then Manuel realized what was bothering him. The first thing he remembered upon waking up was Bernardo's corpse getting to its feet, but he dismissed that as once as fancy. But the other shapes in the light of the meagre smoking fire were not boulders, nor the walls of the low roofed cave, nor the bits of fancy. They were four men who he could now smell over the cooking meat and the wood smoke and the loamy scent of the cave. They smelled like old blood and early rot, like sweat and piss and shit, like all the notes subtle and strong that combine to create the perfume of battlefields and the slaughterhouses, the unmistakable smell of death. And they were watching him with unblinking eyes. Werner, Bernardo, and the Christabels. They were watching him from where they sat, blocking the only exit to the cave. The thunder came again, and Manuel slowly backed away from the fire into the dark recess of the cave. He kept his eyes on the dead man she had brought back to life, but soon his sore hands assured him the back of the cavern ended in the cold, wet stone as the earth as dead man. Sorry, a dead end. She was a fucking witch. Not some poor midwife or Jew or mad woman, but a real fucking witch. And he had loosed her. I think we should probably call it there.
Yeah, I'm super tired. Super good though. Oh,
Hold on 1 second.